Good morning, everybody. I want to talk about healthy habits today, moving towards a healthier life, and just some tips and clues for you all to live a healthier life. So, a little bit of my background is that I have a bachelor's of exercise science from Oklahoma Wesleyan University, doctorate of physical therapy from Missouri State University. Been a physical therapist since 2016. I was certified treat lymphedema in 2017, and I worked for the Public Health Service for a number of years, and got a Master's of Public Health from the University of Arizona online in 2021. Completed that program, and I've been the lead physical therapist at FYZICAL in St. Peter's since it opened in late June of 2025. So the problems that we have are, what kills us basically. And there's top 10 causes of death that's released by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. They release this list usually every year. It's released retrospectively. So that's why they can't figure out, what's killed people for some time. So we have 2023's data right now. And it is 2026, so hopefully the 2024 data will be coming out soon. It tends to run a year or two behind in the release because it takes a lot of research to confirm these causes of death. But when you look at the list, you see heart disease is number one. It's been number one for a long time in the United States. Infectious diseases used to be the number one cause of death in the United States in the early 1900s, the early 20th century. It used to be that things like influenza and tuberculosis was a big killer, a lot of bacterial infections. So, when antibiotics and immunizations started to become much more popular and public health programs were developed, it really shifted the causes of death in the United States from what used to be acute infections to what is now more chronic diseases. So cancer is the number two cause of death in the United States currently, and we see that the number one risk factor for cancer is age. So people are living longer and they're dying more of chronic diseases. Heart disease, obviously, our diet is very impactful, and exercise is very impactful if we're trying to, lower the risk of heart disease. And then accidents is number three, unintentional injuries. So this, I believe, includes car accidents and suicides. So, and falls would probably also be included under accidents, which is a big part of, what I do is fall prevention. So strokes, chronic lower respiratory diseases like lung issues, things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD, would be listed under chronic lower respiratory diseases. And there's lots of diagnoses that fall under these. Alzheimer's disease is number 6, it's pretty notable. Diabetes, again related to heart disease, is number 7. Then we have nephritis or nephrotic syndrome, and nephrosis, so kidney failure, and chronic liver diseases and cirrhosis, so liver failure. And then there's lots of risk factor for those. Obviously with liver disease and cirrhosis, we're talking about, alcohol could be a big cause of that. Also a really high fat diet. And then for nephritis and issues with your kidneys, what we consume has a big impact on that as well. So COVID-19 is sitting at number 10. It's a big shift from the pandemic years. COVID-19 was I think at the top, it was the number 3 cause of death, right behind heart disease and cancer. Back in 2020 and 2021, I think it had the 3rd spot as the 3rd leading cause of death. But now it's down there at number 10. So a lot has changed with, the COVID immunizations, and also when people get COVID, they build up what's called herd immunity. So people who have survived a COVID-19 infection or been vaccinated have more resistance to the disease, and once that is built up over time, and the more and more people have had COVID or had the vaccine, then it's less likely to spread. And older age is obviously a higher risk factor for death from COVID as well, along with comorbidities, and I assume everybody knows all about that. So what I want to talk about today is, what leads to longevity, what leads to good health. And it's a combination of factors. This slide lists genes and biology, health behaviors, your environment, and, your access to healthcare. I like to tell my patients it's like a deck of cards that we all have, and some of us have really good lungs or, really good brains, and some of us have really good, muscle and bone health. Some of my patients have never broken a bone. Some of my patients have broken, 10 or more bones. So it just depends on your hereditary traits, what you inherit from your parents and your family members, the people you descended from. Different people have different traits. Different people's bodies are more adaptable in certain environments. So when you get those genetic traits, they either give you an advantage or a disadvantage. And some people, are born with a higher predisposition to certain diseases. Some people are more likely to, a good example is breast cancer. They've found genes that greatly increase your risk for breast cancer to the point where some notable public figures have had mastectomies to try to prevent the risk of acquiring breast cancer later in life. So that's just one example, but there's lots of examples of genes and genetic traits that predispose us to certain diseases. But our deck of cards is not the whole story. For people who love to play cards, that strategy is a big part of any card game, usually. It's not usually just luck. It's also how you play your cards. I think Willie Nelson has a song about knowing when to hold them and knowing when to fold them. So that's basically what we're doing with our health as well. We're trying to make good decisions, and that's our health behaviors. If you are drinking a lot of alcohol, binge drinking, it's very unhealthy for your body. Using drugs, drugs that are not prescribed by your doctor, drugs that you're not taking according to, the labels on the medications. Unprotected sex and smoking are used as examples in one of the studies that I looked at for this presentation. So smoking is a well-known risk factor for a lot of diseases. There was a huge public health education campaign that was put on by the Surgeon General that led to a lot of improvements in awareness of the risks of smoking. During World War II and the early 20th century, smoking was not considered necessarily a very risky behavior, but then as that generation started to get older, we realized all the detrimental health effects and started educating people about the risks. So, that's what we want to continue to do with a variety of different products. We don't want to, wait until you get too old to realize the negative effects of some of the things we consume on our bodies. So in a nutshell, it's a combination of factors. It's your hereditary traits, it's your behavior, and then a big piece of it is the environment. So I like to add that one in because, our behaviors can put us in certain environments. We don't have a choice of where we're born, who we're born to, or where we're born. We don't have a choice in that. But once we get to be a certain age, we can actually choose if we want to move or if we want to put forth the energy and the effort to relocate ourselves to a healthier environment. And that's where behavior and environment can combine to create really good, strong health effects and benefits in your life. So the combined impact of health behaviors and mortality in men and women, this is the EPIC Norfolk's Perspective Population Study by Kaw et al. In 2008. And they noticed that people who lived longer were physically active, ate 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, consumed minimal and modest amounts of alcohol, and did not smoke. So this is one of the really interesting things. You would expect physically active, lots of servings of fruits and vegetables, and not smoking, right? So a lot of people don't smoke now because of that. Surgeon General and it wasn't just the education, it was people realizing that it was unhealthy, but that Surgeon General campaign in the mid to late 20th century really helped to change, our public health attitudes and perspectives. We made, restaurants, more and more restaurants had no smoking, and that impacts, social behavior and all that. So a lot of people don't smoke now, which is good. A lot of people are becoming more aware of the importance of physical activity because of more public health campaigns. First ladies often promote things. I think Nancy Reagan said, don't do drugs, say no to drugs. And then Michelle Obama talked about, healthy diet and physical activity. So a lot of campaigns have helped to raise awareness about these things. And then people, we have gym classes, we have physical education. So hopefully most people are aware that physical activity is very important. The 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day is something that I see a lot of people don't adhere to. The Western diet is full of processed foods. We call it, instead of farm to table, it's farm to factory to table. And those processed foods often take out some of the nutrients and put in stuff that's not really healthy for our bodies. So the 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, I think, is not actually, a lot of people really don't know that. They really don't understand the importance of that, of a high fiber diet, a high fiber plant-based diet. Fruits and vegetables are plants, and we really don't eat enough plants in our diet in the United States. Minimal to modest amounts of alcohol. So this is interesting. So if this study was actually saying that people who consumed a little bit of alcohol were actually healthier than people who consumed no alcohol. And the importance was not to consume, too much, but the finding that people who consumed a little bit were healthier was really interesting. Don't know who sponsored this study, don't know if that had any impact on it, but I've heard this from other people as well. And one of the theories behind this is that people who drink a little bit are more likely to be at social gatherings. If you're going to your local, bar or pub, or you're going and getting drinks with your friends on a regular basis, or you're having dinner parties and consuming some wine together. Everything that's happening in a lot of those situations, like it can be very social, right? Isolated drinking would not be healthy, but social drinking, it's a social activity. And studies have shown that people who are part of social groups and are part of communities are likely to be healthier and live healthier lives. And this goes from everything from having a marriage partner to, going to church on a regular basis. A lot of these things seem to be social. It seems to be like when we feel connected to each other as social animals, we tend to live longer. So the bottom line up front for this presentation is that you need to get 150 minutes of aerobic exercise per week. I'll talk about what that means. Eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. Spend more time doing things you love, in places you love, with people you love, and people who love you. And then sleep 7 to 9 hours per night. So I'm going to dive into each of these categories. Let's talk about physical activity first. Basically 30 minutes a day. So the Center for Disease Control and Prevention recommends at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, such as brisk walking each week, and then 2 days a week of activities that strengthen muscles. And for people who are 65 years and older, they recommend balance training of some sort, like standing on one foot, right? So this is right up our alley here at FYZICAL. We do balance therapy and all forms of therapy. So we will do strength training with you, talk to you about aerobic exercise, and our brand is really built around balance. We have a safety overhead system that helps keep you safe when you're here. We have ones that you can walk in, and we have ones that you just stand stationary in. But instead of having to use a belt like a lot of physical therapists do, we actually strap you in to something that looks like a climbing harness, if you've ever seen rock climbers, except it goes all the way around your upper body as well, not just your pelvis, and it hooks to the ceiling in what looks like a climbing rope. It basically is a climbing rope, and we have a carabiner that we clip you into, so you feel like you're about to go on a zip line or climbing, but all you're doing is doing all the balance activities that you would normally do in physical therapy, but you are attached to the ceiling in a system that's graded for 500 pounds, so that if you do lose your balance, the system will catch you. So it's nice because it eliminates a lot of fear that maybe the therapist won't catch you. And, therapists are human, so we're not always paying as much attention as we need to. Sometimes it takes us longer than we want to catch a patient. The rope being there also alleviates a lot of, burden on the therapist. So it makes it a good place to work because you don't have to worry about, hurting yourself if you're trying to catch a patient. So there's a lot of benefits to the safety overhead system. We have other balance tools. One of the main things we do too is vestibular therapy. So we have infrared goggles that you can put on, and we can watch your eyes to see how your eyes are moving while we do tests like the Dix-Hallpike test to try to help diagnose what's going on in your vestibular system and if you have a vestibular issue. So we do a lot of different vestibular testing, a lot of different eye testing to try to figure out, hey, how is that balance system performing? And for people who don't know, the vestibular system is basically like a 3D level system, is how I like to describe it, that lives in your inner ear. And there's two of them, one for each ear, and they work together to help tell your brain where your head is located in space. So one of the reasons why if you go on a roller coaster you might be dizzy afterwards is because that roller coaster is spinning you around and really messing with your vestibular system. And if you have your eyes open on the roller coaster, you have a mismatch between sometimes what's going on with your eyes and what's going on with your vestibular system if you're not following it. When I'm on a roller coaster, I always try to follow kind of where I'm going, and I try to have my eyes and my vestibular system in sync. Okay, like I'll turn my head into the turns and I'll look right straight ahead. I won't be looking around out to the side, because if I'm looking out to the side but I'm moving forward and doing different turns, then my eyes are telling my brain, look over there, but my vestibular system is saying we're going this way. So it starts to make me more motion sick. And that can happen in cars too when you're on a really curvy road. That's why for me, when I was a kid, I got motion sick. I would always want to ride in the middle seat, in the back, or in the front to try to watch the road so there wasn't that mismatch between my eyes and my vestibular system. So that's just one example of how the vestibular system and our eyes and our balance systems can lead to issues. So activities to improve your balance become much more important as we get older because our risk of falls gets higher as we get older. Some people have really redundant balance systems. They do a really good job of avoiding falls as they get older. But the reality is, just like with cancer, age is a risk factor for falls because our systems are aging. And age is a risk factor for cancer because our systems are aging. So our cells are more likely to dysfunction in a way that leads to neoplasms or tumors or cancers of our body. So physical activity is really important to help prevent these things. And balance therapy is something that physical offers along with strength training, along with aerobic exercises on our new step systems or treadmills, and lots of education on these topics to help you understand, how to be healthier. So physical activity, you have your cardiopulmonary health, your strength, and your balance. We talked about this. I just talked about this in the last slide, so I won't go too much into it here. But these three things for people who are 65 years and older. So for people who are my age, in the middle age group, people, I think it's your 20s basically to your 60s, before 65. I think the CDC has recommendations for cardiopulmonary aerobic, training of the same thing of 150 minutes a week, 30 minutes a day, and then strength training 2 days a week. So it's like the exact same recommendation, that moderate intensity, 150 minutes of exercise per week, and then the strength training, of 2 days a week. So that's recommended for adults across the board. But the balance therapy to reduce your fall risk is recommended for people 65 years and older. So that's the change that happens when people get into their 60s, because fall risk becomes higher as we get older. To talk a little bit more about the endurance and the strength training, so we have something that's called anaerobic exercise, which means without oxygen, and aerobic exercise, which means with oxygen. So basically we're talking about energy production systems and exercise physiology. And anaerobic means that you have to produce energy without using oxygen as a part of that production process. And the reason for that is because we need quick bursts of energy when our lungs are not producing more oxygen. So we have what's called stored energy. Adenosine triphosphate is the energy that we use to fuel our muscle contractions. And we have a certain amount of adenosine triphosphate that's stored in our muscles and allows us to do quick bursts of activities. So this is what sprinters do. Like, it's basically anything under 10 seconds. Those quick bursts of activity, we have to have that stored in our muscle and ready to go, because it takes our lungs a while to catch up and our system a while to start producing more energy. When we get into really high endurance activities, it's a continuum, so it doesn't just, it like gradually switches from one energy system to another, one energy production system to another. So basically, those short bursts of activity, the really short ones, like 10 seconds or less, rely on stored adenosine triphosphate. Then we use carbohydrates to produce energy for activities that go up to kind of like 30 to 40 minutes. But then once you have had your heart rate elevated at a certain level, and this is really important for activities like weight loss, once you've had your heart rate elevated to a certain level, that's why they say moderate intensity exercise, you want to be reaching your target, what's called your target heart rate, which is another discussion, another topic, but you can look up the formula online. So if you're reaching your target heart rate and you're doing that for 30 to 40 minutes, you are now pushing yourself into what's called aerobic exercise. And that is heavily reliant on aerobic glycolysis, which uses oxygen and fats to fuel your muscle contractions and your movement. So in other words, you start burning fat after about 30 to 40 minutes of moderate intensity exercise that is reaching your target heart rate. So that's important for weight loss. It's also important for training your heart, because your heart has to be able to beat, and it has to be able to elevate its level of work, because your heart's beating all the time. It beats much slower when you sleep, and then much quicker when you're doing something like 30 to 40 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. So let's say if you go for an hour-long jog, or you go for an hour-long walk if you're older, brisk walk, you start to burn fats, for the last 20 minutes of that walk, as long as you're reaching your target heart rate. So that's the basic gist of it, and we can use different systems to measure, exactly how hard your lungs are working, how hard your heart's working, and, how much fat you're burning. What we do is we rely on formulas and estimates a lot. So when you go onto a treadmill, you'll see how many calories you've burned. And you can, walk on a treadmill for an hour and look at how many calories you burn, because they're using formulas, your speed that the treadmill's running at, and the grade that the treadmill's on. So if you're on a higher grade, you're going to burn more calories. And they're just using basic formulas to calculate how many calories that they think you're burning. It's not a perfect prediction, not a perfect measurement, but it's useful, and it's giving you a ballpark figure of how much you're burning. The thing is, for aerobic exercise, let's say you've been on that treadmill for 30 minutes, you're mostly burning carbohydrates, stored carbohydrates from like your meals from yesterday. If you're on that treadmill for 60 minutes, for the last 20 minutes, you're going to be burning more fats, theoretically. It could depend on how much food you've consumed. If you consumed a lot of spaghetti the day before, maybe you're still burning carbs. That's why runners' carbo load is to have more stored energy to burn during their races. For the endurance runners, they want to eat that heavy meal a certain amount of time before their race, so that it's stored and ready to go. It's not yet been converted to fat. It's still stored as carbohydrates, and they can burn it during the race. So it really depends on how much you're consuming and your meals and all that, but the gist of it is 30 to 40 minutes of moderate intensity target heart rate exercise starts to transition you into burning stored lipids or fats. So that's that in a nutshell. And then the strength training is a whole nother animal to talk about. And basically, for strength training, you need to be consistent. At least 2 days a week is good. You want to have slow and controlled motions, ideally to prevent injury. It depends on what you're training yourself for. Some younger people, athletes, are going to train themselves at higher speeds to be able to do the sports they need to do. But for people who are older, people who just want to be strong and have healthy bones and muscles, you want to do an appropriate resistance level and slow and controlled motions, both through what's called the concentric and the eccentric phase of the muscle contraction. And I won't dive too deep into that, but strength training is important, and love to get more into that if you decide you want to come in for therapy, or if you watch some of our other videos, you'll see information about that. So let's move to nutrition. So eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's a quote from a guy named Michael. I think his name is pronounced Pollan. I don't think it's pronounced pollen. I think it's pronounced Pollan, but I'm not sure. But he's a journalist, and he's written a lot about food, and he has some really good books on food. One of the books I really like, I'll show you an image of it later in the presentation, but this is super important to eat healthy foods. So foods to keep you healthy: fruits and vegetables, low fat, low sodium, lean meats, and nuts. Fermented foods like beets, sauerkraut, and kimchi. That's something that I learned from a guy that has a book called The Good Gut. I forget what his name is. Soderbergh, maybe. Soderbergh. But The Good Gut's a book I started reading, haven't finished it, but he has a great podcast with the guy out of Stanford, I think I forget his name, but that talks about the benefits of fermented foods actually for our gut. So appropriately prepared and fermented foods like beet, sauerkraut, and kimchi are actually really good for your gut health. High fiber whole grains like whole oats. So high fiber diet is like the number one thing this guy was recommending, a plant-based high fiber diet. One of the things that Soderbergh gave an example of during that podcast was saying that 15, and I think this is in this book, The Good Gut, as well, 15 grams of fiber a day is basically what we consume in the United States in Western diets on average. But people who live in more hunter-gatherer type societies, I think he used the example of a group of people that live in Kenya, they consume 150 grams of fiber as a part of their daily diet on average. So, I don't have the details for those studies, see how they measured that, but the gist of it is that we really need more fiber in our diet in the United States. We don't eat enough plants, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, and if you notice what I'm recommending here on the diets, it's mostly plants. Nuts are plants, fruits and vegetables are plants, whole grains, oats, fiber-based foods, they're plants. Beets, sauerkraut, kimchi, plants. The only thing that I'm recommending that's not plants are lean meats. So, salmon, chicken, turkey, and there's other types of lean meats as well. Those are my favorite meats to consume. And not everybody needs to consume meats. You can get proteins in other ways. I think B12 is one of the most important nutrients that people tend to miss if they're not eating meat. So, red meat has a lot of B12. Salmon has a lot of B12. Steak has a lot of B12. So you can get that through a supplement, or you can get it through, selectively choosing, your meats that you want to consume. Like, I think pescatarians are people that eat fish, and plants. So you can decide. But the idea, the basic gist of it is that we need more fiber and we need more plants in our diet. You want to avoid high salt, high sugar, high fat, ultra processed, and low fiber foods. So, sorry, I just realized I had an error on that high-low fibers. So basically, you want to avoid low fiber foods. You want lots of fiber. So I like to talk about this a lot because, and here's an image of the book that I would recommend. It's very short, just packed full of good information, and it really gets to the point. That's why I like it. It's not hard to understand. You can read this book in depending on how fast of a reader you are, you can read this book in literally hours, like an hour or two. High fat, high salt, high sugar, and then ultra processed foods. Again, they strip the nutrients out of the foods in order to give them a long shelf life. When they're processing them in the factory, they're trying to extend the life of those foods. They put in basically artificial preservatives that aren't really good for our bodies. And, and I don't want to be overly dramatic on this because processed foods are very useful. I have to give processed foods a lot of credit because processed foods help reduce starvation. Basically, if you can put foods on a shelf for a long period of time, then you have a stored food source, like a squirrel storing acorns for the winter. We have processed foods that can last us a long time. So it is useful to have processed foods in our society, to have some of these things to say, okay, we can survive longer now because we have these. For supply chains, redundancy of supply chains, that's a whole other conversation. But basically, one part of the country or one part of the world is having a harvest when the other part of the world is not. So we have to ship food from one part of the world to our part of the world. And, if we have processed foods that we have stored on our shelves, it gives us more optionality of, do we want to buy, the food from that other part of the world? What kind of price do we want to have it at? Do we want to rely more on processed foods until the price lowers, or negotiate more based upon, hey, we already have processed foods that we're stored? We can can foods, canning and jarring. I think it's just the process is called canning. It's a great way to preserve foods for the winter. We've been doing it for a long period of time. And, there are risks to it. There are negative effects of it, but the positive effect is that we have stored food sources, and a lot of, canned or jarring, whatever the processes are called, it's called canning, I believe. That process of preserving foods is extremely useful. And so to say, let's get rid of all processed foods, I think would be very foolish. But part of the problem with processed foods is that the companies tend to add salt, sugar, and fat to these foods because they've just realized that helps them sell more of those products. So the negative part of that is because we humans are not designed to say no to salt, sugar, and fat very well. And the theoretical reason for that is because our ancestors would have struggled more to find high salt, high sugar, high fat foods. So what we do is we seek out those things because we realize they are rare commodities or valuable commodities. And they would have been more rare and more austere environments that our ancestors lived in. So in other words, the idea is that we are not designed to say no very well to salt, sugar, and fat, because for a lot of our ancestral history, we were trying to access these nutrients, and we did not have as much access as we desired to them. So, I could go on about this. It's really important to look at the contents on the labels. That's why they're there. If you see a high number beside saturated fat, sodium, sugar on the back of food packages, it's a good thing to try to avoid them. You want to see low numbers on all three of those if you can. You definitely don't want to see high numbers on all three. So I try to look at the back briefly of the packages and say, okay, what's the number by sodium, what's the number by sugar, and what's the number by fat? They have really cool apps now that you can just pull your phone out and take a picture of the package or scan the barcode and see if it's healthy for you. I forget the names of the apps, but there's plenty of them out there, and you can look them up online. You can also look up, the recommended daily amounts of salt, sugar, and fat each day. And if you were to calculate them, how much you're consuming, you would see that in the Western diet, we tend to consume way above the daily recommended amounts of these ingredients. Some people have a hard time with salt. Some people have a hard time with sugar. I'm more of a sugarholic. I'm more of a sugar addict. I'm not as fat's not as much of a craving for me as for other people, I've noticed. But sugar and salt, for me, number one is sugar, number two is salt, number three is fat. Those are my weaknesses in that order. And you probably, if you pay attention to yourself and what you're consuming, you'll probably realize that you tend to gravitate towards one more than the other. So for me, I have to work hard to avoid sugar because that's my number one, craving. But let's move on to sleep. I'm going to talk quite a bit about sleep. You should get 7 to 8 hours a night, or 7 to 9 hours a night. I like to say 7 to 9 because, teenagers sometimes need 9 to 10 hours of sleep a night. And if you're a parent, you may notice this, it's harder to pull those teenagers out of bed. Well, their bodies are growing too. They're in their growth spurts, so getting 9 to 10 hours is good. And with all the screen time, it's difficult to do that with all the stimulus and distractions. It's hard to get that amount of sleep to get teenagers to bed on time. But have some empathy for those teenagers, because their bodies are really craving a lot of sleep, and kids need this much too. As children and infants, especially infants, need a lot of sleep. But for adults, older adults especially, they don't get as much sleep. Our bodies and technically don't need as much sleep as we get older. When you're getting into your 60s and older, 7 hours can be adequate. But it depends on the person. Some people crave more sleep than others. Some people need more sleep than others. And 7 to 9 hours is what I would recommend generally across the board for adults. The risks of sleep deprivation, and a lot of this information I'm getting is from a book called Why We Sleep. I'll show you the title here later in the slide deck. But, Why We Sleep has a lot of good data. It's by Matthew Walker. There's a lot of good data on why sleep is so important, and really, I think, is a good book to educate yourself on just the importance, the awareness of sleep, and how it is one of the pillars of health. So cardiovascular risks, we have a higher risk of heart attacks when we are sleep deprived, and higher risk of obesity with chronic sleep deprivation. Cell and organ health, chronic sleep deprivation may lead to a higher risk of cancer. There's not good research on that right now, from my understanding. The studies are inconclusive as to whether or not chronic sleep deprivation actually increases, your risk for cancers. But I think there is a study that shows that melatonin, chronic intake of melatonin, I have to see if I have this right. It must be on the other slide. Can actually increase your risk of cancer. I'll confirm that on the other slide. But once you lose sleep, you cannot get it back. Sleep is like time; it can only be spent. So I like this idea. I think it's something that people are not really educated about. We think we can just make up our sleep the next day. It's not the way it works. Once you've lost your sleep, you're not gonna get it back. It's not something that we can just I can't get 10 hours of sleep tonight and then 5 hours sleep tomorrow and say I'm good. I've lost sleep on that. I will have lost sleep tomorrow that I can't make up. So, and then you can see here on this chart that the average sleep amount, and then obese individuals in the United States, you see how sleep goes down, obesity has gone up. Of course, there are confounding variables for this piece of data because our diet has probably become much worse over that time as well. But we know that we tend to have higher risk of obesity when we lose sleep. So if you're like me, you love caffeine, but one of the important things to note about caffeine products is that caffeinated products cannot make up for sleep. It's basically a painkiller. In Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker talks about how caffeine is kind of like taking a pain pill. It masks your pain, but it does not take away the effects of it. So you can see here in this graphic that when people had less sleep, they had a higher risk of being in a car accident. And in Why We Sleep, I think Matthew Walker compares running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep to driving like buzzed with under the influence of alcohol. So it does not improve your reaction times when you take caffeine. It basically just masks the feeling of tiredness that you have. So This effect of disrupting your sleep is also true for alcohol, which is interesting as well. I didn't know that before I listened to his book. And it disrupts what's called rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. So drinking a lot of alcohol is not good for your sleep. So try to avoid consuming any food 3 to 5 hours prior to bedtime, and try to avoid drinking fluids, especially caffeine or alcohol, late at night. So in Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker talks about how even drinking water right before you go to bed can be unhealthy for your sleep, because you have to get up during the night to go to the bathroom. So even if you're drinking, a lot of water right before you go to bed, water's not bad for you, but it's going to disrupt your sleep because it's going to cause you to get up in the night. So he actually I think in the book he advises against drinking a lot of fluids right before bed. And he also advises not to drink any caffeine after 12 p.m. With alcohol, I don't know what he advises on that, but drinking a lot of alcohol certainly before you sleep is not good. Maybe a glass of wine in the evening might be okay. But again, we go back to minimum amounts of alcohol are healthy, but excess amounts of alcohol are not. And again, the CDC has come out with they came out at some point with a recommendation saying that any alcohol is basically poison to your body. However, there are social benefits to drinking alcohol that seem to have positive health effects, which we talked about earlier in the presentation. So caffeine does not make up for sleep. So what do you do if you want to sleep better? Well, if you want to sleep better, you can consider these sleeping tips. Take a warm shower or bath right before bed. Moist heat can help you relax. We use that here in the clinic for people's low back pain and other painful areas. Moist heat is really relaxing and can help muscles, relax. Keeping your sleep room cool. I think 67 degrees is what was recommended in Why We Sleep, but 67 to 69 may be ideal. It depends on, how cold you get. People who are older tend to prefer higher temperatures. People who are younger tend to prefer more cooler temperatures. And so it depends on your metabolism, I think, and how much body heat your body's putting off. You can always use extra blankets. So if you keep your room at 67 degrees, I would just use extra blankets on your bed, because that's going to help you, your body, rest and relax. So one of the reasons why I think people think that those lower temperatures help us sleep is because our ancestors would have had to, they wouldn't have had temperature regulation as much. So we know that temperatures go down when the sun goes down, and now that we have thermostats and indoor heating and cooling, we have a lot more temperature regulation in our lives. However, in the past, people would have been resting during the hot part of the day. In the middle of the day, they would have been trying to find a cool place, and at night they would have been trying to find a warmer place because of the coolness. So keeping those things in mind, artificial light, which we'll talk about, is also highly influential on our sleep patterns. And so we may not be getting as good sleep because we have a more regulated environment, which allows us to stay up later into the night and work instead of sleep, when we should be, sleeping and resting. So dedicate different parts of your house for work and sleep. So, keep one room for work, one room for eating, one room for sleep. So your bedroom should not be for work or eating or exercise. It should be for sleeping. Some people, reading helps them get to sleep. Other people, it keeps them awake. So I'm the kind of person, if I read with a pen in hand, I stay awake pretty easily. So it's not really good for me to read in bed because it'll keep me up. But for other people, reading puts them to sleep because they tend to fall asleep when they read. So it just depends, I think, for that one. But screen time is really bad for sleep. So any time looking at your phone or watching television, being on a computer before you go to bed, that's not good for your sleep. that light is hitting your eyes and telling your eyes it's time to stay awake, because when the sunlight hits our eyes, we tend to wake up. You probably have experienced this in the morning when the sun starts to come in through the window and hit your body. It wakes you up in a gradual and gentle way. Oftentimes, the more the room is lit up, the harder it is for you to sleep. Oftentimes, so if you're looking at a phone in a dark room, it doesn't matter that the room's dark, because that light's still hitting your eyes and keeping you awake. So that screen time is not good for us. Going to bed at the same time each night is really important. A lot of people don't do that. I don't do that. It's hard. It's difficult. You have to kind of be in a routine, and if other people are in your life and disrupting that routine, it's difficult to maintain it. We also have different obligations and events that may disrupt that. So that, however, is the most important tip that I believe is given in Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, is saying going to bed at the same time each night is the most important thing you can do in order to maintain a healthy sleep schedule and to get more sleep. You can wake up at sunrise. You can use natural light to help wake you up. That would be ideal. Not everybody's going to be like that. Some people are night owls. Some people are morning persons. So, morning people may wake up before the sun, and night owls may want to wake up after the sun. So it's just an idea that if you have that luxury of waking up at sunrise, with daylight saving time, it makes it really difficult too. In regions of the world that are around the equator, there's less fluctuation in daylight hours. So, if you're at the equator, it's pretty much, I think, 12 on and 12 off of daylight hours. And if you're near the equator, it only fluctuates by 30 minutes to an hour all year. So you can really maintain a schedule where you wake up in the morning with the sun and go to bed when the sun goes down. But in other areas, like for instance in Alaska, that would be impossible because of the way the schedule is. So there are other things you can do, though, to improve your sleep schedule. So what leads to a good night's sleep? Going to bed at the same time each night is the number one piece of advice that Matthew Walker advises in Why We Sleep. Getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night as an adult. You want to exercise in the morning or early afternoon. So exercise, like caffeine and alcohol, is another one of those things that can wake you up right before you go to sleep. Screen time, we talked about that. It's another thing that can keep you up. So exercising right before you're going to go to bed is not advised. If you have, if you're a night owl and you want to exercise in the afternoon or evening, and because you're going to stay up until midnight or a little bit later, then that's one thing. But your circadian rhythm should really be consistent if you can. So that's why the number one piece of advice is to go to bed at the same time each night. A warm shower right before bed, a chilled room around 67 degrees is ideal. 69 degrees if you have a warmer body temperature. Throw on a lot of blankets. Try to get that cooler temperature around you that our ancestors would have had, that really helps to incentivize the body to sleep. Avoid caffeine after 12 p.m. Avoid food and fluids right before bed, especially alcohol. And wake up with the sun and reduce your exposure to artificial light at night. So we can't always wake up with the sun, especially with daylight savings time. It does not always allow us to do that. And then, in higher latitudes, temperate zone and more tundra areas, you're going to have fluctuating daylight hours. So we cannot always, stick to the same schedule. So we can't always wake up with the sun. But more in equatorial regions, you can really do this and have a consistent sleep schedule across the year. It works pretty well. And then of course, we all can reduce our exposure to artificial light at night. Avoiding screen time right before bed, using the bedroom for sleep only, and stay in bed when you're having trouble sleeping. That's a big one. A lot of people who have, it's one thing if you have insomnia for other reasons, if it's hereditary or if you have some type of other acquired insomnia. But it's one thing if you just have trouble sleeping at night, try not to wake up in the middle of the night and start working on something or doing an activity. Try to really give yourself extra time in bed. If you do get up, try to do something quick that's relaxing, then go right back to bed. Try to reduce the exposure to television or artificial light, because again, that's going to wake you up. Eating is going to wake you, anything. Exercise at night's usually going to wake you up, so it's just not advised to have a really active lifestyle during the time you're supposed to be sleeping. That's going to confuse the body and disrupt the circadian rhythm. So I'd like to give a lot of education in sleep during this presentation because it's something that's really not talked about a lot. And, another thing that is a pillar of health is what I would call mental or social health. So we want to surround ourselves with people and places and things that we love and that love us back. So that type of social behavior is normal for humans. We're a social species. So there's 7 factors that predicted healthy aging. This is, I believe, I don't know if I have the citation here, but I believe this is from the Harvard longevity study. There's been, I feel like, a few different books that have been written on this topic, and in academic papers. But 7 factors that predicted healthy aging in the Harvard longevity study, which was a study of multi-generational study of factors that helped these groups of people be healthy. Those longitudinal studies are done over many years, and they track multiple variables and help to predict help to kind of address those potentially confounding variables that aren't really captured in a snapshot study. So the 7 factors that predicted healthy aging were not being a smoker or stopping smoking at a young age, an adaptive coping style or mature defenses. This is a psychological defense mechanisms that different psychologists have talked about. I think one of the psychologists to really talk about defense mechanisms was Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. And then there's a absence of alcohol abuse. So again, minimal amounts of alcohol can help us through helping us engage in more social drinking and having a social lifestyle. But excess amounts of alcohol are very unhealthy. Alcohol abuse is very unhealthy. Just like smoking, it leads to a variety of cancers and unhealthy effects. A healthy weight, so not being overweight, so your body mass index can measure this. You can also do an even better measurement is body fat percentage. A stable marriage relationship was predictive of healthy aging, so more longevity for those who are married. And those types of relationships, along and relatively happy marriage, it can help protect against negative health effects. So spouses can be a support system. They can end up being your informal counselors. They can help you hold you accountable for going to the doctor. There's I don't know, I don't remember if the effect is stronger for men or women, but I would suspect that the effect of a stable marriage is stronger for men than for women. It benefits probably men more than women, but I don't know. I can't say that for sure. That would be something to look up, but the stable marriage tends to work both ways. If you have a relationship that's worth staying together for 40 or 50 years, not all 40 or 50 year marriages are perfect, but if you have a long and stable marriage over multiple decades, usually you're getting something out of that to stick with it. So, that social support system becomes very important. Some exercise, so minimal to moderate amounts of exercise is important. Again, CDC recommends 30 minutes 5 days a week. for a total of 150 minutes of aerobic exercise, and then the 2 days of strength training, or you can do 15 minutes on each of those days. It doesn't take very long to do some strengthening exercises, whether it's push-ups or free weights, or sit to stands, like squatting to and from a chair. There are a variety of simple exercises that can just help keep you strong, especially as you age. And then balance training of some sort. Like you could do yoga, you could do Tai Chi, you could do other types of just balance exercises, practice standing on one foot without holding on to anything, as long as you're safe to do so. Those types of things are very important, especially over the age of 65, to help prevent falls. And then years of education. This is something, that a lot of people, this is an effect that's shown with income a lot of times. It depends on your degree. It depends on, what type of education you're getting, what level. But typically people with more education tend to make more money than people with less education. And then it also works for health. So we know that socioeconomic status, how much money you have coming in every year, really helps to reduce, it can help to reduce stress. It can help to, increase your longevity. Certain things like, alcoholism affects the wealthy and the poor pretty similarly, but other things tend to affect the poor much more, especially infectious diseases and certain exposure conditions that are unhealthy. Stress is a big one, a lot of stress-induced things. Neighborhood effects, so the zip code that you live in. If you have years of education and a higher socioeconomic status, you're more likely to live in a zip code that doesn't expose you to as many stressors and negative health effects or exposures. So making and breaking habits is a big part of, this behavior, right? This way that we can influence our health. So we can't always choose where we're born, what zip code we're born into. We can't even always choose how much, money we're making or what our, salary is going to be. There's certain things we cannot control, but we can try to influence them through going back to school, if we can, or through, leveraging our connections to try to find a, higher paying job. A big part of this is just in your everyday behaviors. For instance, we've talked about going to bed at the same time every night can help you get a lot better sleep. We've talked about how limiting the amounts of alcohol that you're consuming to a minimal amount for social drinking rather than alcohol abuse, not smoking, how these things can really change your health. So there's a book called The Power of Habit. I think his name is Duhigg, Charles Duhigg. It's a great book that kind of talks about it breaks down habits. I think he's a journalist, the guy that wrote this book, and really did a lot of research on habits and tried to figure out, hey, how can we change our unhealthy habits? And he broke down the habit loop into, a cue, a routine, and then a reward. And lots of times there's like a stimulus or a cue, something in your life that you're exposed to that really makes you crave the unhealthy thing. For a smoker, it may be stress. A lot of things are stress related. Drinking can be that way too. It could be your exposure to a certain environment. Being around another smoker, another drinker may make you, want to consume alcohol or smoke. So these, exposures to the stimuli, that's your cue often to try to engage in the routine that gives you a reward, which is often stress relief. If you're seeking a type of drug, for me it would be sugar, caffeine, those types of things help to, the reward for caffeine for me is I feel less tired. The reward for sugar is I feel that stimulus after consuming sugar. But the negative health effects are that I don't get enough sleep at night if I drink too much caffeine, or I don't respect my body's, need for sleep. It can also be for sugar. I raise my blood sugar level, or I damage my teeth over time through consuming too much sugar. I damage my, more likely to lay down, plaques in the arteries, or those sugars are more likely to be converted to I forget what it's called, but lipids that can be laid down in the arteries, can damage the heart over time. So it's fatty foods, sugary foods, they're not good for our arteries and not good for our teeth and various things. So the idea is to try to identify your routine. What is the cue or the stimulus that is happening that is giving you the incentive to do the unhealthy behavior, and then try to experiment with different rewards to avoid that stimulus or that routine. So you're isolating the cue and you're saying, okay, what is it that is causing me to do this negative behavior, and then what is my plan to avoid it? So implementation intentions are if-then plans that spell out in advance how you're going to strive for a set goal. So one of the ways I like to do this is to try to replace my unhealthy behavior with a healthy behavior. But, for instance, for me, exercise is a great way to relieve stress instead of going to caffeine or another negative health behavior. So exercise is a great way. When I do routine exercise, I sleep better, and I also avoid other negative health behaviors like excess consumption of sugar and caffeine. And then there's other like healthy behaviors, like reading. For me, is a really healthy behavior. Instead of watching television or consuming too much screen time, or sitting in front of a screen and watching YouTube funny cat videos that I'm never going to remember are going to benefit me at all, other than a quick laugh, I can go ahead and read a book that is more beneficial, that's going to help me retain more information and learn something that I can apply to my life. So Charles Duhigg in his book uses the example of him in his office. He would go and he would get a cookie from the cafeteria at the same time each day. I think it was in the early afternoon. And he was trying to figure out, why do I go and get this cookie every day? And so he decided that he was doing it either because he was bored, he just wanted to change his routine and get up from his desk because he had been working, and it was the afternoon lull. It could be that he was a little tired, so he wanted a sugary kick. So he was kind of saying, okay, it's either boredom or probably I'm tired. So he decided, and this is not, I may be messing up parts of his story, but the gist of it is intact, I think. So I believe what he did is he tried to replace it with like a water break. Instead of going to the cafeteria to get the cookie, he would just go to the water tank or whatever, the water cooler where everybody tend to hang out and talk, and then he would just get a cup of water instead of going for the cookie. Or he could take a walk outside instead of going to the cafeteria, and then just return to his desk. So those are examples of how you try to get a healthier behavior, like a social activity, or getting some sunshine and walking outside away from your workplace, to try to fill your need, which may not actually be a need for a cookie, but it may be a need for just getting up from your desk and being in a different environment for a little bit. So that's an example, a practical example of how you can try to replace, a bad routine. So another way to interpret, development is not just through the individual habits and how we, behave on a daily level, what these little actions are that make up our day that we need to change, but across a lifespan, the stages of life is another way to look at, a healthy social life, or, healthy mental health. So there's a psychologist named Erik Erikson that came up with these stages of psychosocial development. I think he called it, I forget what the name of the book is that he wrote on it, but it was, I think, psychosocial development across a lifespan or something like that. But he broke up these stages of life. So when he went beyond just these stages from infancy to early childhood to adolescence and adulthood, and he expanded it for like the entire life. So we know that infants have important stages of social development, like learning to walk, learning to talk, bonding with their caregiver. We know that early childhood, it's important for children to learn how to be autonomous and to say no. You know, the terrible twos or threes, you know, when toddlers say no all the time and they just enjoy saying no. It's an important part of their development to be able to learn how to be an individual and say, you know, I have the ability to say no, I have the independence to say no, and to make my own decisions, and they're developing, that's an important part of their development. Then there's, you know, the preschool age and the school age where they're learning to take initiative for themselves, to take more responsibility for themselves, and to have this ownership over their life, to identify things in their life that they're good at, and to, you know, have their caregivers be proud of them for certain efforts that they're putting forward to grow. And then there's the, you know, adolescence where teenagers are trying to form an identity and, you know, figure out who they are, deal with puberty and all of the, you know, hormonal changes that happen with that, and they're trying to develop their frontal lobes and create their own identity. So the last, you know, stage that we often think of is just when kids turn 18, then they're now like adults and they're on their own. But Erickson said, you know, there's more stages to life. Young adulthood, people have to form relationships, intimate relationships. Otherwise, they can become isolated and damage themselves psychologically through not being able to form these close friendships and close relationships that they need to be successful in life, to have a social group that they're a part of, to feel an identity with the group. Then in middle adulthood, you know, often people they have kids to take care of, and then oftentimes they're also taking care of their parents at the same time. So it's a really important stage of life where, you know, people need to feel productive. They need to feel like they're a part of a community, that they're giving to that community, that they're helping that community, that they're providing for others, especially their kids and their parents often. And, you know, it's a lot of pressure in this stage to be responsible and to be the one that's, you know, helping to, you know, maintain both those relationships with younger people and those relationships with older people in a healthy way, you know, that carries your community forward. And then the maturity stage is like, really, we're looking at the ages of the patients that I often treat, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s oftentimes, where they're trying to learn how to deal with the aging process. They're going through pain, you know, as they get older. They're losing some of their independence oftentimes. And it's a big challenge to have this positive attitude and this courage to face that pain and face that loss of independence with a sense of resolve and determination to do the best they can in spite of the inevitable decline that comes with being, you know, mortal and getting to a point where we all, you know, have to pass away, because most people will die in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, you know, regardless of how many benefits their life affords them. You know, we're not designed to live forever. So that process, it can be very painful. And so people have to learn how to prioritize the things that they still can do, to take pleasure in those things, and to not always compare themselves to who they were, you know, as a young adult or as a middle adult. So one thing I like to use an example is some people may choose, instead of having like 2 dogs and a cat to take care of, they may choose to take care of just a plant because it's an easier thing to take care of. It doesn't require as much attention and care. It doesn't require as much time and financial resources. So they may say, you know what, I really enjoyed having, you know, a dog, but at this point in my life, I don't think it's good for me to have one. I think I'd rather just have a plant to take care of, which will still bring me joy, but be easier for me to deal with, and allow me to spend time doing other things, like time with my grandkids, or time with my friends and family members, or time gardening, or doing a hobby that I, you know, enjoy, that is less dependent on me on a daily basis. So I think that part of maturity is that understanding of, I can't do everything, but I can do, a lot. So it's still, and I can do a lot of things that I still enjoy. And I think people who get older tend to discover wisdom in part because they're learning to prioritize the most important things rather than trying to do everything. And I see the healthy tendency is during the maturity stage as looking back on your life and being grateful for the things that went really well instead of focusing on the things that didn't go well. Instead of focusing on the regrets, focusing on the things that you were thankful for, trying to, dwell on the good memories that you have. That can be a really healthy way to spend, your life as you get older instead of spending it on regrets, spending it on things you're thankful for. And, we really can do that throughout our lifetime. But I think these habits are a unique part of the maturity stage of Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. So I like to share that just so people, know that we have the responsibility to grow throughout our lives, not just, at one point. So, and there's certain challenges throughout the lifespan that we have to approach and stages of development that we need to, work through. So these resources with Food Rules is a very short book, really great for the diet, Why We Sleep, and then The Power of Habit. These books are some of the things I drew on for this presentation, and I think that are really helpful if you're trying to figure out how to change your behavior and improve your health. I specifically, chose these three because I feel like these are parts of our, we often hear about exercise. We often hear about, the importance of having close relationships. But I feel like a plant-based diet is really underemphasized in the United States. Sleep, I feel like, is really underemphasized in the United States. And then I feel like the United States has, a big problem with basically addictive behaviors. And The Power of Habit really gets into like how to try to address some of those addictive behaviors. So there's just 3 books that you could look further into if you're curious about how to have a healthy lifestyle. So here's some sources that I used for the various slides. So if you're interested in looking in greater depth, you can check them out. But overall, just want to encourage you to focus on healthy habits, getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep at night, exercising for a moderate amount of exercise, moderate intensity amount of exercise, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, getting in your strength training 15 minutes for 2 days a week, doing some balance training if you're 65 years or older. Then also, hanging out with people that you love and who love you, and eating a plant-based diet, really focusing on getting more fiber, 4 to 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So that's the gist of the presentation. I will have a shorter version that I'm going to upload if you're interested in a shorter version of this presentation that's not so detailed and meandering. And thank you for listening, and have a great day.